Hello there, and a warm welcome from the team here for Digital Foundry Direct Weekly number 243. It is our weekly show where we discuss the gaming and technology news of the week. Joining me, first of all, John Linneman. Hello.
Hey, Rich. How's it going? It's good to see you.
Good.
Happy to be here. That's us 2 consecutive weeks. So
Yes. Yes, John. And
Thank
speaking
you.
of yes, Oliver McKenzie.
Yes, Rich, here to talk about some of my favorite topics. Lots of Switch 2 stuff. Should be a fun time.
Good stuff. And well, with that, just a quick reminder that our new website is online, www.digitalfoundry.net. Do check that out. And of course, store.digitalfoundry.net. Check out our merchandising wares, walking about with apparel with our logos on it. It's the future. Okay, but with that, let's move on to our first news topic. Okay, so this week, big week for Nintendo. Metroid Prime 4 has been released, and we're going to be talking about it. We're going to be talking about the review reaction, difference of opinion there. But crucially, we didn't actually have access to the Switch 1 version of the game until launch, oddly enough. And so I thought I'd take a look at it. And well, let's just get straight into it, shall we? I mean, we have seen a trailer before, which was purportedly running on Switch 1, which we're going to have to revisit in a bit. Let's talk about the final version here, though. And I'd say that ultimately, what Metro Studios has done here is actually a really, really good version of the game. It's a very accomplished counterpart to the Switch 2 version, bearing in mind the yawning technical chasm between the two chipsets we've got there. Let's just take a look at some comparison footage here. You'll notice immediately that the biggest difference, and pretty much I'd say the only difference in terms of gameplay as such, is the fact that the resolution is cut back significantly. The docked mode, first of all, it looks like native 720p there with a 900p visor. Now, that one's going to be interesting because when we saw the initial Metroid Prime 4 trailer, which seemed to be running on Switch 1, that was actually operating at 900p at the time. So we'll talk about that at the moment. But otherwise, the main difference, I think, beyond the resolution is just basically the precision of everything and the fact that you're getting much better quality textures on the Switch 2. John, it's a game transformed, isn't it, really, when you're playing it on Switch 2? I mean, obviously, we kind of did it in reverse this time, in that we played it on Switch 2 first and then went back to Switch 1. But man, I mean, it's still a good-looking Switch 1 game, but it's worlds apart from Switch 2.
Weirdly enough, the feeling I get from going back to this reminds me of when you would go from like a really top tier Xbox Series X game, and then you'd look at a low quality Series S version where perhaps they didn't quite get the execution down. They sacrificed some things, the resolution's cut way back, and everything just looks kind of messier. And that's basically what we have here. But this is definitely a case, though, when you take it on its own terms and you consider the Switch 1 hardware isn't all that much capable than Xbox 360. Let's remember that. This is not a very powerful machine. I think this game looks phenomenal when you consider what the hardware is. Like, it's a gorgeous game that runs at a locked 60 frames per second on the Switch 1, with the only real sacrifice being texture quality, which of course makes sense, and resolution, which you're gonna have to sacrifice that to get 60 FPS. And my guess is that perhaps they did drop the resolution during development. I mean, that stuff's not really fixed right in place, so maybe to get that last bit of performance out, they had to drop a little bit further. But either way, that is the big differentiator. But obviously, being that this was a Switch 1 game, I think they made really smart choices in bringing it to Switch 2. It doesn't drastically alter the assets or anything, but you basically get a much sharper, more precise presentation. The extra textures, resolution, everything makes a big difference. And it's also worth noting that when you play in the 120 hertz mode, you're still getting a gigantic leap in image quality. Even though, because you're dropping to 1080p to get the 120 mode, but like the image treatment, textures, everything is much, much better than Switch 1, which is at 60. Yeah. So it's nice.
What do you think about anti-aliasing? Because I'm not seeing much evidence of it on Switch 1, and whereas on Switch 2, they actually did a pretty good job, bearing in mind it's almost certainly a post-processing in nature.
Well, based on the intellectual property notices, it is SMAA, and it's consistent with the results of SMAA, and the resolution of SMAA combined with that, yeah, it's definitely a lot better. I think in the comparison shot where you're walking into Volt Forge for the first time,
Yep.
you look at the area above the door on Switch 1, it's just a mess of shimmering pixels, which makes me wonder if they're just foregoing any sort of anti-aliasing, because the image is so much noisier there, and you really feel that. In addition, of course, because not only are the textures less sharp normally, but because of the lower resolution, it also has an impact on texture filtering, as we know, since that scales with resolution. So like when you're looking across a flat surface, oblique angles especially, like the textures just turn into mush on Switch 1. Plus, beyond all the image quality stuff, Switch 2 also gains access to HDR, which,
Right, of course.
as I said in my review, it is honestly one of the best HDR implementations I've seen in a long time. Like the range between dark and light and the brightness of the highlights, it's enough to make Oliver sweat. Like, that's how bright we're talking here. It's very well done, and I'm a big fan of it. But conversely, so this is the other interesting thing. I picked up my Switch OLED yesterday for the first time in a while, and yeah, I did feel like I was surprised at how good it still feels in my hand. I think a lot of people still prefer the Switch 2, and they're both good. They're nice feeling machines, but the screen, man. I mean, we know the OLED screen is superior to what's in the Switch 2. That it was always clear that that's the case. But in this case, more so than usual, because there's so much camera rotation, the response time of the Switch 2 screen stands out a lot more. Plus, the Switch 2 screen has a single LED backlight, which means it glows in dark areas, of which this game has plenty. And just on the strength of that, like I feel like the Switch OLED in portable mode ends up looking better in many ways. It's definitely not as sharp. Image quality is definitely worse, but like it even almost looks more like HDR on the OLED screen, despite being SDR, because the Switch 2 screen just can't actually produce HDR, and they're of similar peak brightness, but you don't have that contrast range on the Switch 2. So
yeah, if you were telling me yesterday that the 120 hertz mode in handheld on Switch 2 just doesn't work for you because of the screen.
Yeah, the screen doesn't. I mean, it's been measured now. We have numbers on this. The screen is not technically capable of fully representing what 120 frames per second can show. Right, the temporal resolution isn't there, and sure enough, it just smears the image. And so as a result, you kind of lose the key benefit of 120 hertz is that, I mean, it does look smoother, yes, but you also improve motion persistence, clarity, and you don't get that benefit on the Switch 2 screen. So
that's quite an interesting comment for you to say there about playing it mobile on Switch OLED, because we've got pixel counts here from Oliver of portable mode. 504p for the scene, 576p for the visor. So and it is a bit chunky.
Yeah, and that's definitely a case where the screen size helps, right? But even at that screen size, you'll definitely notice additional pixelation. And because of the lack of motion resolution on the Switch 2, I actually think the 4K, not 4K, the 1080p 60 mode and portable mode on Switch 2 is the way to go. And it is appreciably more detailed. It's very, very sharp, no doubt. It's just the motion stuff and the lack of the poor black levels that stand out.
Mm-hmm. Oliver, what's your take on all of this?
Well, I'm just really impressed by the way this game looks. I've had the opportunity to play maybe an hour or two over the past day, just a little sampling, but I'm super impressed by the way that it looks. It has phenomenal baked lighting, great materials. It just looks beautiful. The size of the environments outside of that central hub area, they're pretty small on the smaller side, but I think that really gives them the opportunity to really dial up the baked lighting quality and make everything just look pristine and really put that artist time into making sure that everything looks fantastic. I'm a little bit surprised in terms of the resolution counts that they're cut down from Prime Remastered so much, but after playing it, I think it makes more sense just based on the visual fidelity that they're targeting with this game. Prime Remastered was 900p and 576p, I believe, so it's considerably cut down from those numbers, obviously. But basically here, Switch 2 quadruples resolution, which is a similar finding to what John and I found in a variety of Switch 1 software that was updated for Switch 2, right? And other Switch 2 editions as well. Basically that it's very common that on Switch 2, both in handheld play and docked play, if you still have the resolution headroom in terms of not maxing out the display hardware, you'll get a quadrupled resolution target in addition to oftentimes more stable frame rates, or at least very comparable frame rates. Here you're basically getting quadrupled resolution and 60 FPS, or something closer to like a doubled resolution and 120 FPS, which I think is quite good. And here, of course, in this case, you're also getting much higher grade textures, which I did definitely notice on Switch 2. The fact that you get up close to that 2D art and it holds up miraculously well. I'm sure they really put a lot more storage into those assets, which is quite impressive. So yeah, I was just very pleased by the quality of this port in general. Like it is a game that clearly has a Switch 1 lineage, but it's also still one of the best looking Switch 2 games on the platform at the moment. I think it's really impressive.
Yeah. I've got a couple of final points to add. Firstly, performance. It's basically a non-issue. It's 60 frames per second, as you would expect from Retro Studios, especially if there's been a resolution cut instigated. I mean, it's just pretty solid. We did try the desert where John found some very minor, and I'm talking like almost imperceptible frame rate drops on Switch 2. I found a frame rate drop there, but otherwise pretty solid.
I found a couple more, very similar. From a bit later in the game, but yeah, it's a non-issue. It
is a non-issue.
A single frame here or there. It's almost imperceptible.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest issue I had with the Switch 1, and it's nothing to do with the software, it's to do with the fact that I had the Pro Controller to play it on Switch 2, and I had to use the Joy-Cons for Switch 1.
Ooh.
I just couldn't get on with them at all for this game, for first-person shooter. The second point I wanted to make was just generally, and we're going to move on now to more general discussion about the game. My point on this is pretty much on if anybody else makes a first-person shooter, you instantly know what you're kind of going to get. They all feel very much the same. You know, it's kind of like almost like a common language for first-person shooters on PC and multi-platform consoles. But this is different. It just feels different. It's compelling. It's in the fact that it's not instantly familiar. Probably is to people who've played a lot of Metroid games in the past, but it stands alone. It's very different from the kind of first-person shooter you play elsewhere. The Nintendo difference, it's something tangible. I think it's quite superb. Secondly, I think the quality of the visuals on Switch 2. I mean, yes, you can see the Switch 1 origins there. Obviously, the game would have been developed mostly with Switch 1 in mind across its lengthy development period. But the changes they've made to, get the most out of the Switch 2 architecture, I think they pay off. I mean, certainly in terms of image quality and in terms of just like, tech art, the quality, the craft here is just superb. Certainly a few shades of, I think, Halo 4 on Xbox 360, but obviously this is running at twice the frame rate on Switch 1, which is pretty awesome.
Indeed.
Yep. Okay. John, let's talk about some of the review reaction here. In fact, I'm just going to read out some supporter questions. Let's have a quick sortie through them. This one from Some Guy Person. I've noticed that you guys generally seem a lot more positive with game reviews than other reviewers, particularly with the Metroid Prime 4 review. A lot of reviews effectively say it's not that different from other Metroid Prime games and old equals bad. I've also seen negative reviews for Yooka-Laylee simply because the reviewer doesn't like that style of game in the first place. Are your reviews better because you get to choose what you cover? Is because you guys value older games as much as newer ones? What makes your reviews unique and different from the rest of the industry apart from the technical aspects? 1040 STF asks, there's a pretty striking split in the reviews for Metroid Prime 4. What do you think is going on there, John, especially since you're firmly in the quote-unquote this game is awesome camp?
Wow, yeah. I'm in that camp along with Dan Reichert, apparently, and a few others that also loved it. This is a very complex issue, and I've discussed this with some of the reviewers, and so it's a mix of things. There is some degree of like the nature of critical reviews these days, the critics and the way they write about things, and I feel it in movies, I feel it in games, where it's just like trying to think overly deeply about something versus feeling it. and I talked about this with 1040 STF himself, actually. And it's just, I don't review games like a critic because that's not what we do here. I just take them based on I don't know. It's just like what I truly feel. I'm not thinking as deeply about it, maybe, or maybe it's really, it's difficult to say, but the way it hits me is I find that my opinions often do differ from a lot of the normal media sites. And I'm always surprised. Sometimes things that I love review not great elsewhere, and then other things that I don't love are like raved about for the ages. And I'm always like, what the heck's going on here? So one, I've accepted that my tastes are just a little different for whatever reason, and that's fine. But in the case of Metroid, a lot of the complaints seem to be centered around story stuff. Specifically, people didn't love some of the addition of the Marines. They didn't love the like there was a real focus on like, well, Samus doesn't talk. It's like there's a scene where you walk into a room and the Marine is like identify yourself, and they can't see you. It's Samus. And then Samus sort of steps out of the shadows, and he's like, oh, it's Samus. Where like they're like, well, if she just said it's me, Samus, that would be a much more natural scene. And there's some truth to that, but in reality, like it doesn't. One, it's like 10 seconds, so it shouldn't influence your overall opinion on the game. But two, like it's fine. Like just walking out of the shadows versus saying something, I don't know, it works fine for me. Those types of complaints don't register. And also, I don't know, some people didn't like the structural changes because this shifted to more of like a Ocarina of Time style design where you have like a large map interconnecting the worlds rather than the worlds being directly connected to one another. But I didn't mind that change. I thought it was actually a cool change and interesting. And in addition, I like all the power-ups. Some people expect certain new power-ups. They didn't get the new power-ups, and they're like, well, these are just like the old power-ups. Like, I wanted new power-ups. And maybe this is a matter of expectation, where, yes, it has been in development for a while, but people form expectations of this is what the game should be. And when it's not that, then they're going to, they subtract points from it, so to speak, is the way I feel. Where I try to take it more as like, this is what the game is. Does this work for me? But I don't know. It's a very complicated issue. I'd have to think more deeply about this, but I will say is like my experience with the game, and this is something about covering games early, is like, by the time players have played this, they will have been exposed to like a lot of opinions about Metroid Prime 4. When I got my hands on Metroid Prime 4, I didn't know anything about like what it was going to be like, right? Like all we had were these little bits of previews, right? That's it. It's a completely fresh opinion based on my own personal experience. And when I walked away, I had a freaking fantastic time. It controls like a dream. I think the core level design in all the main areas is phenomenal. The visual design is great. Atmosphere, gameplay, puzzle design, enemy encounters, all largely excellent. And it still feels very, very unique. They don't make a lot of games like this today, right? What this game is not something you can go easily find anywhere else. And as a result, it just has there's just something about being in that world, about playing it, about picking up those controls that really resonated with me. So when I stepped back and realized like, wait, a lot of other people didn't like this, it's like being blindsided. I don't know. Maybe you experienced this back in the day, Rich, when you were doing more reviews. I'm curious about your thoughts on this kind of situation.
Well, John, I'm going to put it really, really straightforward. I don't care what other people think particularly.
Okay, that's it. That's good.
Well, you think about Top Gear, Jeremy Clarkson. Does he think about, what other people think about his reviews?
That's true.
No, not really. Ultimately, you go to Jeremy Clarkson for a car review because you trust his opinion, right? Similarly, for any kind of reviewer, if somebody has a certain degree of following from the audience, they trust their opinion, and maybe they'll disagree with it. But ultimately, I think the bottom line is it comes from the right place, which is the fact that you enjoyed the game. What's wrong with that?
That's true. Yes.
And there are games that we don't enjoy.
Yes, absolutely.
For different reasons maybe, but that's kind of it. So basically, what I'm sort of railing against here is this need for people to have a consensus, to accept a sort of settled consensus on opinion, which I think is actually what you don't want. You don't want to have everybody saying the same thing about a game.
Yeah.
What you want is a different series of opinions to draw from, based on trusted reviewers. And I would say that you are a critic based on that, John, but because you've expressed an opinion and backed up your opinions, and that's
I guess so. I suppose that's right.
Yeah.
Oliver, thoughts?
Yeah, I think in terms of what this game is, it is very similar to the other Metroid Prime games so far. Indeed, obviously 2 years ago, I replayed Metroid Prime Remastered for Digital Foundry review. It did remind me a lot of that experience in a lot of ways, albeit more streamlined in some sense, at least so far. But I think there's maybe a critical lens where people have expectations that games will have deep innovation or changes. And I agree that's necessary in cases where you might have a series that's kind of run its course. You've had this experience, you've eaten this meal over and over again, and you're a little bit bored with it. But Metroid Prime 3 came out 18 years ago, so I don't have that problem necessarily with this game. It still feels interesting to me, and like John said, it's an experience you can't really have in any other game series necessarily. There's nothing exactly like this out there in the world. On the positive review side of things, and us maybe being a little bit more positive about things potentially, if a game isn't for me, like flat out isn't for me, like I'm playing like a racing sim or a sports game or something and I'm reviewing that, I just won't talk about my experiences with the game because it's not in my wheelhouse, it's not in my genre. So I just won't mention anything. If you don't hear anything from me about a gameplay in a review, probably that means I didn't like it, but I might just not like it because I don't like the genre, right? But if a game isn't in my wheelhouse, I will try to offer some criticisms. But part of the reality of producing a video in potentially 4 days is that I'm focused on comparisons, I'm focused on graphics, I'm not so focused on gameplay. It doesn't really lend itself to giving you a broadside critique of a game. Maybe in some cases I do have that time, like I spent a week and a half, 2 weeks producing a Persona 3 Reloaded review. I felt like I had the justification and the time to offer some fairly concrete opinions in that game's remastering and remake process that I wouldn't have had if I'd only spent like 4 days with it. But the latter case is much more common than the former. So I do have to be a bit judicious in the kind of critiques that I make. At least that's how I personally feel with some of these reviews.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to another question, actually. This one from K-Back. Hear me, digital overlords, ! With a reveal that to get background music whilst traversing the desert in Metroid Prime 4, you need to purchase the amiibo. Do you think this is the start of a potential new lucrative revenue stream for video game publishers? Perhaps we could buy music in game by stage, or buy each individual sound effect. But you have to buy it to hear what it sounds like first. And of course, no refunds available. What say ye? ? John, I mean, you don't spend a huge amount of time traversing the desert, do you? But at the same time, it doesn't come across great, this look, does it?
I think this is bullshit. Pardon my French. I really, this is a terrible practice, and I don't want this to catch on. I'm not sure it will catch on. Nintendo does like to do this kind of thing from time to time. I had no idea that this was actually a thing until people actually tested it. And I wasn't necessarily bothered by it because there's still like an ambient track in the desert, but there was points, especially in the late game, where you do have to spend more time out in the desert, where I'm thinking like, man, it would be nice if there was like a good theme out here. And then I learned there is actually music. You just got to get this freaking amiibo to hear it. And that sucks. That really sucks. I don't think that's a good practice at all. I really don't think they should have done that. I think if they wanted to do something with music, they should have made it like a bonus track or some kind of like additional thing where it's like just for fun, maybe like a classic remix of a Metroid song or something.
Yeah.
But like, this is an area that absolutely would benefit from having a strong theme song. And the fact that they didn't do that is like puzzling to me, locking it behind this. I don't get it. I really, really don't get this.
Yeah, you'd want it to be some sort of inconsequential add-on, really. Maybe sort of a remix of the Benny Hill theme tune, for example.
Sure, why not?
We got this question here from Anxiously Goddard Figured. Hello, gentlemen, ! What would you say if Retro Studios had a chance to work on the next Halo game? I think they'd be one of the few studios out there who could revive the franchise. And if not them, who would you like to do it? Cheers! ! John, I can kind of see the the rationale here, because this game does have that kind of very stylized individual aesthetic that Halo kind of used to have.
Sure. And yeah, in fact, some people that have worked on Halo did indeed work on this. And Halo 4 was also famously inspired by Metroid Prime to some degree. And it's all like come full circle, right? Some of those people from worked on Halo 4 then come back to Retro Studios and they're building this. So yeah. But let's be clear, Halo and Metroid are so dramatically different in terms of what they represent gameplay wise. And there's no indication that Retro Studios possesses the desire, the talent, whatever. And I'm sure if they really wanted to staff up and do this, they could, but I haven't seen anything that indicates that they're ready to make Halo. Just like I certainly wouldn't want 343 or Halo Studios to make a Metroid game. Goodness me. But Halo is just a different beast, right? Like, even though there's visual similarities here, like the core game design, the way the combat works, it's drastically different. If we're talking about who I want to revive the franchise, I don't know, maybe Bungie. Although Bungie these days, who knows? But I mean, I think 343/Halo Studios they never really figured it out. They never got to that Bungie level. Halo 4 was a technical showpiece and a pretty cool game. Halo 5 had some good stuff going as well. And then they didn't make bad games, but they never made truly Halo caliber games. The Bungie quality Halo games, they never got there.
Okay. Any final thoughts, Oliver?
No, not too much. I really didn't mind Miles McKenzie as much as some of the previous
your namesake.
My namesake. But yeah, I did not find him as I did not find him as annoying as some previous suggested. There are some pretty cringeworthy lines in there, but on the whole, he's not that bad. I kind of expect that maybe they're trying to funnel people into maybe more of a directed experience with this game, and maybe that's a bit of a reaction to some lower sales in prior games. Maybe they're trying to find a bigger audience. I don't know if that rings true at all with you, John. I think that's something they might be trying to do with some of the radio messages in particular.
How far did you get, by the way? Currently?
I'm like a couple hours in. I'm in the electrical tower area.
So you made it to Volt Forge. Okay.
Yeah.
The thing I noticed throughout most of the game, a lot of the game anyway, it kind of breaks connection with those Marines and you don't end up speaking that much to them. But then, of course, conversely, there are actually some dungeons where you're with those Marines and they're part of it. I actually grew to like them, okay, because it's not just Miles McKenzie, right? There's several Marines in the game. And in fact, they all kind of have different personalities and purposes and all that. And most of them are not silly. Miles McKenzie is the only one that's a bit silly, although one of them did remind me a little of Big Bo from Binary Domain, which, in my book is always a good thing. But that's a game could use a remake or like a sequel. But actually, interestingly, one of the complaints people had is with Miles, for instance. If you're out in the desert after about 4 minutes, he will buzz you and say, hey, maybe you should go to this area, if you're not sure where to go. And that was actually a function that was in prior Metroid titles as well, Prime titles. But here it's not optional, right? If you remember in Metroid Prime, it would be like, oh, there's an anomaly detected over here. And it would like zoom out on the map and then show you like, like here it is. That's what Miles is doing. They just put a voice to it. But yeah, I think you should be able to turn it off if you want. But I think the reason they have this more than anything is because of that desert traversal. It would be more frustrating if you're like not sure which, like there's the one point where you have to upgrade your bike. You got to go back to Volt Forge to do it, but it wasn't actually all that clear to me. Like, oh, you actually have to go back to this area to get that upgrade. And so if without being alerted to that, it would have involved going to each of the different areas and kind of poking around until you find the thing you're looking for. So it's actually, I think it was just to keep people on track to prevent you from having to go all those long distances to find it, because other Metroid games where you are wandering like that are far more compressed. So you're not going to spend as much time and you're more likely to just run across the thing.
Okay, well, that's that. Let's move on to our next news topic. Okay, so next news story I just put on the docket here. Skynet kills crucial RAM. I'm just going to read out the report here from Reuters. A memory chip maker Micron Technology said on Wednesday it will exit its consumer business as it doubles down on advanced memory chips used in artificial intelligence data centers amid a global supply shortage of the essential semiconductors. And yeah, it will halt the sale of the crucial unit's consumer-branded products at retailers, e-tailers, and distributors worldwide, but will continue product shipments through the consumer channel until February 2026. John, this one's profoundly disappointing and kind of depressing because, crucial memory. For those who build their own PCs, I mean, didn't you buy some in the 90s?
Oh yeah, I mean, Crucial has been around a long time, and the Micron brand. I mean, this has been a staple of PCs for so many years, and I'm surprised that they've reached the point where even though they're making money on their consumer business, it's not all the money. It's not enough money versus what they make in AI, that they've just decided to kill it off. And with already exploding memory prices, I feel like this is extremely concerning for the near future, maybe even the far future of PC enthusiast building. Right? Like, memory is so important to this. And by constricting it further, reducing the number of manufacturers available to consumers, that's only going to drive prices up further, I fear.
Yeah, it's a seismic shock to the ecosystem when there have been reports that motherboard sales are down 50%. It kind of makes sense, right? Because, you typically buy a motherboard to upgrade your entire system.
Right.
Maybe you're moving from DDR4 to DDR5, or maybe you're moving on to the current generation of, say, Intel processors, which requires, an upgrade. That's not great. We got this question here from Jack Ballinghoff. If the current memory nightmare persists longer than expected, could we potentially see older/less memory become a norm for the average PC user? If so, could this potentially push developers to put a higher priority on memory optimization for future software or not? Thank you, smiley face. Oliver, I don't know about you, but I don't think it's going to see a kind of developers targeting lower amounts of memory. I just think it's going to be developers targeting the current amounts of memory, and that's kind of it. I think we'll talk about this later because we've got another topic coming up, but it is almost like we're going to be at status quo for a long time if this thing continues.
Yeah, I feel that's definitely true, but also like in the realm of this whole memory discussion, we have to consider the fact that the handhelds are typically fairly memory starved, and it seems like there's this push to support the handhelds for some long period, if not indefinitely. Obviously, there are all kinds of rumors about the PSX handheld maybe having 24 gigabytes of memory and other PS6 consoles potentially with certain capacities of memory that may change in the future, according to the wins in the memory market. But I tend to think that in general, I think we are indexing to like the current spec of things, the current console platforms, the current amount of memory that's in computers, and just not moving forward. And that's for a variety of reasons, right? Obviously, Moore's Law plays a big role in that, but obviously the fact that we're dealing with these cost pressures in PC components, that's a very serious issue. And I don't think it's going to get better anytime soon, but perhaps this is not the only culprit in this instance.
Okay, so John, what's your take on this?
Basically, the risk I'm seeing right now, and this might actually have a silver lining, is a bit of stagnation in the hardware market, where we don't see as many appreciable upgrades as you might normally expect within a given time frame, both in the console and PC space. The silver lining, though, here is that, as we know, game development has become increasingly expensive and time-consuming, with modern large-scale games taking upwards 5-6 years to develop. That's entire console generations now, right?
Right.
So by slowing the progress of hardware, conceivably, that sort of gives developers more time to target those specific current platforms, right? Which maybe isn't a bad thing. Because, yeah, hardware upgrades, they're nice. I do enjoy them. I love seeing what new hardware and new tech can do. But if the games and the developers can't keep up with it, then it's not as important. It's maybe more important on the PC where you can sort of leverage your existing library and improve it. But in the console space, this could wind up, allowing developers more time to target existing platforms. But of course, as you guys mentioned, there is this, talk about next generation. There's talking about the new Sony handheld. What does that mean for that? I don't know. And I wonder about Nintendo as well with memory situation in general, where the Switch 2, they're selling a lot of them, but imagine if they had launched a year earlier, how much better off they might have been in terms of the costs on these things. Though obviously if the software wasn't ready, then it wouldn't have done them any good anyway, but still. Having launched a brand new system in the midst of all this global turmoil, between rising costs of memory, the tariff stuff, all of this stuff coming together to create a market that's somewhat hostile towards these manufacturers.
Yeah. My concern is, already memory prices in the market are getting bigger and bigger. I don't know how much of that is actually down to the core pricing and how much of that is retailers sniffing out, that they could actually make a lot more money through the scarcity. But obviously Micron / Crucial are one of the biggest suppliers of memory to that market, and them disappearing from that market really is problematic. Any final thoughts, Oliver?
No, just to say that it's just a reality of AI that it has some negative externalities, and this is probably not close to the largest issue that people might have. But I think it's become pretty obvious for a while that AI is going to crowd out consumer hardware to some degree, because it is higher margin, it's delivered on longer term contracts, more lucrative contracts, it's more predictable. Even at TSMC at the moment, if you look at the A16 node, which is their node after 2 nanometers, Nvidia is the only customer. I think that AI is very real and it's moving very quickly, and there's a lot of progress being made. Obviously, there's a lot of negative and positive externalities to that. But at the moment, I think it's natural that a really high margin product, as long as it remains high margin, would crowd out other possibilities, even though that's very negative for us, right? Obviously.
Oliver, that's an interesting thing. So as the AI enthusiast on the team, I'd like you to explain, where is this money going to be made? Because there's so much investment happening in AI at such a huge scale. This can't, you've seen the losses that are being taken to get to this point. Where are they going to make this up? What is the product, and where is this money, the return on investment, coming from?
I mean, the question is really one of investor subsidy, right? Because right now the AI market is being sustained by enormous subsidies. If investors get cold feet, they can pull their subsidy. But ChatGPT, right? It's $20 a month for the pro subscription. But to a lot of people in a vacuum, that's worth hundreds of dollars a month. So if everyone just pulls their money out and says, okay, you're on your own, find a profit, they can probably find a profit. Now it'll be a profit on a smaller market, much smaller market than they're trying to achieve. ChatGPT has 1 billion weekly active users. It's insane, but they only get there because of really aggressive subsidy. So it would be a different situation. It would be a different kind of market, a different kind of situation. Progress might be a little bit slower, things like this. But there is a market for the services as they exist. And then, of course, if things keep progressing and you have these great AI agents and things like that, and all this is out there in the market, that has potentials that are hard to really think about because they don't really map onto conventional technology rollouts. So that's kind of the situation at the moment. But it is an enormous amount of money. OpenAI is going to lose, they say, $100 billion, over $100 billion between now and 2030. It's colossal relative to other technology rollouts at other firms that have lost money traditionally. But it's also a different technology. It's a really different technology, right?
I see the potential there, but it just seems like everyone's putting all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. But more eggs than they've ever put in any basket ever before.
Yeah. If it burst, I don't think it'd be as bad as the 2008 financial crisis, because housing is a much more durable commodity that's really.
No, I was thinking more the .com bubble era.
Could be .com level, yeah.
It kind of shakes out, and yes, there's a final product where they kind of start to discover this is the actual viable path for this stuff, and then all the other wacky ideas out there maybe don't make the cut, so to speak, and money's lost there. So I
Yeah,
don't know, I'm
that could
curious.
happen. But obviously, the internet over the long term has been great, right? But obviously, there was a bubble.
Oh yeah, yeah,
It
yeah.
might be similar, right?
There
Yeah.
was a bubble, and when you look at the bubble era of products, there was some wild stuff happening, and I think we're seeing a lot of that
Pets.com.
in AI now, right? Where
Yeah.
it's like everyone's trying everything, and it's costing a lot of money, but I don't think all of those ideas are necessarily long term viable or even that useful. So
Yeah.
On the flip side, John, we could see a lot less Grok is this true posts on Twitter.
I would be okay with that. I would
Yeah.
like to see less of those.
Fair enough. Okay, let's move on. Okay, this is a really nice story. It turns out that the Nvidia 50 series GPUs launched without support for 32-bit PhysX, meaning that a lot of great older games that use some fantastic PhysX effects, they were running on the CPU, which resulted in drastically lower frame rates depending on what your CPU was. I'm not sure how it was done. We'll have some conjecture, some thoughts on that shortly. But 32-bit PhysX support is now back for the Blackwell architecture. There is support for a number of games. And good news story, right, Oliver?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty good story. Basically, Nvidia is coming back and re-supporting certain games using some kind of technique that we're not quite familiar with at the moment, but they're re-supporting Alice Madness Returns, AC4, the Batman games, which is great, yep. Borderlands 2, Mafia 2, Metro 2033, and Last Light and Mirror's Edge, which is great. And they're also planning Arkham Asylum, which is that first Batman title. They're going to plan that in for 2026. So I think this is good. Basically, they're targeting of the 40 odd 32-bit PhysX games. They're definitely targeting the top tier of those games. They're targeting the games that people complain about. They're targeting the games that Alex complained about when they removed 32-bit PhysX support from the 50 series. So I think that's very positive. And, I'd love to see us go back to more of a PhysX era of PC exploration. But at least you can plumb the depths of that at the moment on a 50 series card with reasonable performance. I think that's a very positive sign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John, there were some crazy sort of workarounds happening. People buying old Nvidia GPUs to put into a spare slot just for the 32-bit PhysX CUDA acceleration there. What do you think about this? I mean, surely, it must be an emulator that they've put together.
Sure.
Here, in which case, the concept of them doing it is kind of crazy. I mean, I've heard about some crazy NVIDIA things they've done in the past, like Vulkan support for the GTX 750 and the 750 Ti was apparently entirely a 6-month software project gone mad. But the concept that they took on board this feedback that this limited number of old PC games that would no longer run with hardware accelerated PhysX, now getting it back. Kind of crazy.
I think that's actually surprising to see a corporation like that to actually find whatever budget they spent to make this happen for old games like this. There's no new money in these games, but it does a lot for the brand in terms of positive publicity, right?
Yeah.
Because it's just most of these games are PS3 era games that were excellent on PC and had extra features.
Yeah,
I think I'm very excited to see that the current list includes Mirror's Edge, which was always one of my favorite examples, as a beautiful game on PC, but those PhysX added just that extra touch, which just looked awesome, especially the cloth stuff and everything and blowing in the wind and breaking apart. Really, really neat addition. So I'm really happy to see that they're actually extending this out, because that was a bummer for those older games, because obviously with modern hardware, these games are so simple to run. You can push through them at ultra high resolutions and frame rates, which makes revisiting classic PC games a joy these days. Like I was doing the other day, I messaged you. I was playing Call of Duty Infinite Warfare again, which is not PhysX enabled, but I was able to do downsampling where the game reported the internal resolution is 10,240 by 4230. Which is beyond 8K. It's it's like 9K ultra wide. I guess
ultra wide 8K. Yeah,
ultra wide 8K.
Yeah,
and because the game is limited seemingly to 125 frames per second, and some of the older Call of Duty titles have issues with high frame rates. I was able to just push it to the limit, and it's like insanely sharp. Beautiful to see it, and it really brings these old games to life in a way, because a lot of them suffer from this sort of like annoying in-surface aliasing and like shimmering and other problems like that, especially in their original resolutions, that when you downsample or go to these ultra high res resolutions, it really just cleans them up and you can appreciate the art like never before. So being able to do that and get the PhysX back, that's cool.
We got this supporter question actually from Matt. Hello, gents. With a limited return of 32-bit PhysX to specific games, will that open the way for modders to be able to apply it to any games Nvidia does not add it back into? What have been your favorite PhysX implementations over the years? I think we just mentioned the favorite ones, but I actually saw a thread on Reset Era where Nvidia Inspector has already been used to enable whatever support this is, emulation or otherwise, to run on other titles. So I suspect it's just a matter of refining whatever technique it is that they're using until that happens. But you can force it on now, apparently, which is pretty good news. So yeah, I don't know what to make about this. It was one of these things where, you know, there was a workaround to get it working. You could just buy any old Nvidia GPU, put it into an extra PCIe slot, and you were kind of good to go. You didn't need a particularly high performing one. But now it just all runs as it should. And I think that's kind of like, you know, I'm not going to say nature is healing, but I do think that a new GPU that comes out should actually have full support for all of the features the old one had. If it doesn't, that's a bit of a bummer. But yeah, a good news story there. I'm not sure we got too much more to add to that, so let's move on. Okay, so this morning Oliver wrote me a message in Slack saying, I want to do a PSA on the new Sonic games, Sonic Racing Crossworlds, right, Oliver? I immediately thought, well, maybe there's something wrong with it, but it turns out there isn't, and you've got some nice things to say about the Switch 2 version.
No, there isn't really anything wrong with it. I suppose that statement could have been interpreted a few different ways here, perhaps a negatively framed way, but I actually think this is pretty positive. It seems like a pretty good port to me. So my interest pre-launch in this game, or pre the Switch 2 launch in this game, was exactly where it would fall relative to current generation consoles and last generation consoles, because current generation consoles are 60 FPS with like the full visual feature set. Last generation consoles have a few things stripped out at 30 FPS with poor frame pacing, and Switch 1 has like pretty degraded visual features and at 30 FPS with very poor frame pacing, because that's not very good at all. But basically here it seems like it's closer to the Switch 1 version in some ways, but that actually has some positive reverberations for image quality and performance. So like if you just look at Switch 2 versus Switch 1 here, it looks a lot like Switch 1, but at 60 FPS and at higher resolutions, which is pretty good. It definitely looks a lot better here. But you're also seeing the excision of some post-processing effects. Some things like this, some cube maps are simpler, things like this are not in the mix potentially on Switch 2. And if you look at Series S, it's clear that, again, a lot of those visual features are still missing, primarily post-processing, SSR, which is a really key part of this game's visual makeup in the more artificial courses, and Bloom, all those are gone. But Switch 2 perhaps correspondingly looks clearer and sharper than Series S. That's an interesting division, where it actually looks a little bit better in that respect. And if we do some quick pixel counts, we can see that Switch 1 appears to be about 720p in this game. Series S is about 1080p, and Switch 2 is around 1440p, maybe a little bit below 1440p. So that's a pretty big resolution bump over Switch 1, and actually superior resolution to Series S, which I'm quite surprised by. But again, perhaps that's accounted for by the removal of all those post-processing features. I think this is an interesting move. Actually, we've seen similar moves from other developers, most recently the Tomb Raider Definitive Edition, where the Switch 2 version inherits a lot of the Switch 1 compromises for the Switch 2 edition, right? It's basically that version ported over instead of what you would think of as being a more proximate platform like a Series S cut in half or a PS4 or something. It's not necessarily that version. It might be the Switch 1 version enhanced instead of the versions from the home consoles downgraded. In terms of the overall game, I don't love it. I don't think it's as good as Team Sonic Racing, either visually or in terms of the gameplay. Definitely relative to Sonic Racing Transformed. I'm sure John can agree it's nowhere near that title.
Agreed.
But it's okay enough. If you have a Switch 2, I'd recommend you get Mario Kart before this and Kirby Air Riders. But if you do like kart racers quite a bit, as I tend to, I would buy this before Garfield Kart 2. I think this is above that level.
So, John, what do you make of that?
I like the choices they've made here. So this is a game that is being released with the Switch 2 version on the card as well, which I think is great. So I think
they have to do that because it's a Switch 2 edition.
So it's officially a Switch 2
edition. It has to interoperate
edition,
there, yeah.
Which is awesome. I like that system. It's the same with Metroid, by the way. And it's weird that it has to be this way, but it feels like this is a solution to get more Switch 2 games on card as opposed to using game card key or whatever. Like they should allow you to ship games on the slower storage if they don't really need it, right? If you don't need the faster stuff, ship it on the slower, smaller card. There you go. Better than game card key or game key card, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, compared to Series S, like you said, there's definitely some cutbacks, post-processing, SSR, stuff like that's missing, but the image is a lot sharper.
Yep.
And it's very, very smooth. So like they definitely made some cool, good choices on this. It's just a shame the game itself is not as engaging as some of those Sumo Digital developed kart racers have been. And also those use that Sumo engine as opposed to Unreal. So it automatically feels a little bit, you see a lot of those Unreal commonalities in terms of certain rendering features as usual. But still, 60 FPS Unreal game, Switch 2, good enough resolution. I'm into it. Okay,
fair enough. I was just thinking, obviously in the past I've made it clear that I just don't see why Sonic would be using a cart. It is in there, as I've said in the past.
Recreation, Rich.
Yeah,
it's up there with God needing a starship in Star Trek 5. But then I was thinking about Garfield. He's a bit lazy, probably wants to get about in some sort of vehicle.
Yeah, I hear in Garfield Kart 2 they gave him a mobility scooter.
Wow.
that may or may not be true.
That would be a different... Maybe that's a sort of franchise offshoot they could do.
That would be pretty fun.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Let's move on. Next news story of the week, and this one is quite remarkable. CD Projekt Red has reaffirmed plans to release an entirely new trilogy of games in the Witcher franchise within 6 years. Now, bearing in mind it currently seems to take about 5 years to create one game, the concept of doing 3 and 6 seems kind of mind-boggling. We've got this statement from CD Projekt Red saying, in a way, yes, I do believe that further games should be delivered in a shorter period of time. As we had stated before, our plan is still to launch the whole trilogy within a 6-year period. So yes, that would mean we would plan to have a shorter development time between The Witcher 4, 5 and 6. Yes, John, bearing in mind we're in a situation where, for example, Naughty Dog hasn't delivered a brand new game for the entire console generation, simply because the amount of time it takes to make a game. This does seem extremely ambitious, but at the same time, it's all about really how they plan to execute it, right?
They could be taking a Matrix Reloaded Revolutions approach here, building them all at the same time. Yeah, it's also kind of like the dream of episodic content that we saw back when, Telltale was around and they actually pulled it off. But then you had Half-Life with the episodes, the Sin episodes, which got one episode, that kind of thing. maybe they're developing it in that way so that they're like able to leverage the same world and basic structure and a lot of elements shared between them to tell 3 stories. But if not that, then I really don't see what else they could do, because it's launching 3 games of that scale in that amount of time seems frankly impossible otherwise.
Yes and no, because, we have for good or for bad, we get a new Call of Duty every year. And previously, like Assassin's Creed used to produce a game every 1-2 years. It's doable, right, Oliver?
I think it is doable, but it's really... You're kind of touching on that kind of tension there, Rich, with the mention of Call of Duty, because Call of Duty games are developed kind of asymmetrically on like 2 or 3 year time cycles for the most part, it seems like. And they're very, very similar in terms of gameplay, but also engine technology. Everything about them is pretty similar from year to year. Now, there are some differences. Perhaps, Modern Warfare 3 did not have a traditional campaign, and some people objected to that, including John. They didn't like that very much. That was made in a very short time period, as far as I understand it. There's also some recent controversy with Black Ops 7, again, having some problems with its campaign, potentially. But I think that the realities of producing these games within 3 years would make them a little bit different. Like, you'd have to reuse assets, you'd have to keep text similar, you'd have to reuse gameplay systems. I think we can see this a little bit with a game like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, where according to the developers, that was made in 3 years after the release of Intergrade, basically. And that was made under similar kinds of constraints, but again, you see visual problems, you see different kinds of issues with that game, you see fairly similar gameplay. But I think the promise of this is that you'd be working with Unreal. You have tech that ages better. You also have tech that doesn't need to be iterated on by the team. Perhaps they have some leeway there in terms of adding new visual features. But I do think there's some question about how the audience would feel. Like, how would people perceive Cyberpunk 2077 if by now we also had Cyberpunk 2078 and 2079? I don't think that original game would have sold 35 million odd copies. I think there would be a little bit more fatigue around it. I think it'd be perceived a little bit differently. So I hope they wouldn't run into that problem necessarily. But I think tech-wise, at least looking at the early showings of The Witcher 4 with their demos, which might not correspond fully to the final game, but hopefully will substantially correspond to the final game, I think you can see there a very rich-looking title that probably would have technology that would scale okay into the 2030s with some sequels, right? So I think this is a viable approach if they manage to stick it, which I'm not sure they can. But if they did manage to stick it, I think this would be viable, potentially.
It's an interesting one because we can kind of assume that the first game that's going to come out, whenever that is, would be cross-generation in nature.
Right.
There would be advantages then. You'd expect for a couple of years. Actually, no. I was going to say a couple of years later, maybe the cross-gen period would be over, but I kind of don't think it will be at this point.
No.
But yes, I do think that there will be continuing improvements to core technology, and obviously the assets will continue to be generated in that particular period. I just think it's more of a logistical issue at this point. I don't really mind if there isn't huge graphical upgrades from one to the next, because everything we've seen so far suggests they're kind of going to nail it. Unreal Engine 5 development will continue regardless of, CD Projekt Red being involved or not, and they are involved. So I don't know. They must have weighed up the pros and cons here and figured that it's doable. John?
All AI. Everything is all AI generated. They figured out the ultimate prompt.
Yes,
it's taken years, but they've done it.
Brought to you by Copilot.
Oh no! Sorry, Rich. I wasn't using Copilot today.
Man.
Here comes the whip again.
Yeah, I don't know. I can only assume that there is a plan here. And I guess we kind of just need to wait and see what they come up with.
See.
I mean, to what extent will there be sort of cross-pollination across all three games? It's kind of got to happen, hasn't it, Oliver?
It does have to happen. I suspect, even if you look historically at some series, like they mentioned the Mass Effect series here, that had a 2-year cadence between releases, but again, it was Unreal 3. They were building on it a little bit more, but perhaps that was a bit of a different era. But I really do think that they'd have to have a lot of commonality between releases, especially when you consider the scale of these games and the amount of content that needs to go into them, and the amount of time that content takes to iterate on and develop. It probably takes, that full 3-year period at the very least. Maybe they would even reuse the open world, substantially, which is what we saw with like Tears of the Kingdom. Potentially that's another approach they could take. So I think it's like, I don't think it's like totally unrealistic to do this, but I do think it would require a reuse of gameplay and engine that we've never seen from CD Projekt Red, especially with the Red Engine titles, because they were always evolving their core technology, always overhauling their core technology between projects and not making that kind of reuse, right?
Mm-hmm. I guess also if you're going to be developing in parallel, you could have a lot more development, a lot more developers rather, or maybe even split teams, kind of moving between one and the next. Any final thoughts, John? I mean, it's literally not too much to go on here. It's just entire speculation.
It's a little, I guess it's a little odd to me that a company like that would want to get that many games out so quick, because I always thought CD Projekt's games occupy a very enviable space similar to Rockstar, where people just play them forever. Right? People are still playing The Witcher 3. They're still buying The Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk. Like, they just seem to exist in the public consciousness for many, many years and continue to sell. So, like, this seems like a slightly risky approach. Like, you could say, oh, yeah, if they're able to deliver more and more and more, they'll just keep getting more sales. But that's not, I don't know if that's actually necessary here. We'll see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, they do have a track record of delivering exceptionally good expansions.
They do, and in fact, some of the expansions are good enough where, like, I would say Blood and Wine could have almost been its own, like, game to some degree. It borderline felt that way, right? Different environment, plenty of story, lots to explore. It was awesome.
Mm-hmm. Albeit from a different generation and a different series of development priorities. But, you know, you look at Phantom Liberty as well.
Also good.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, let's move on. Okay, so there was a fascinating interview posted on WCCF Tech this week, where the site was talking to Filippo Tarpini, who is a developer at Remedy, an industry veteran, no less. And basically, he's becoming a bit of a, how can we say it, a savior for HDR in gaming. It's one of these situations where HDR is awesome. It's potentially game-changing. I think, John, you talked about it, how much of a difference it made in Metroid Prime 4 this week. And I think it's fair to say that things aren't going to plan with HDR, and Filippo's trying to do something about it, right, John?
Yeah, so he's basically become an HDR evangelist and is pushing all sorts of solutions, and he's done mods and stuff for games. Luma, I believe it's called. That's what he's been working on. And which was instantly made available for things like Hollow Knight Silksong, by the way, which I used straight away. And yeah, the idea is that a lot of developers they've struggled to implement HDR at all or in a meaningful way. And from what I understand, a lot of companies like Epic Games, for instance, with the Unreal, they're not very helpful to developers in terms of actually solving these problems. And there's not a lot of good documentation out there in terms of how to implement it. And so a lot of developers are just sort of left hanging in the wind. If they want HDR, they kind of got to go at it for themselves and figure it out. And it's not trivial. It seems like it might be, but it's really not. There's a lot of factors to consider. And Filippo specifically has spent a lot of time figuring that out. And the results, based on his work, I would say he absolutely knows what he's talking about. And the key that you want from a good HDR experience really is this strong contrast between absolute darkness up through extreme brightness. And what we've seen with a lot of default HDR implementations is that it often raises the black floor, which washes out black levels, or like the application of highlights is done in a very weird, arbitrary manner that doesn't feel physically plausible or even all that visually attractive. Kirby Air Riders is one of the worst I've seen at this, where the whole game has this sort of like dull, washed out tone in HDR, except for the craft exhaust effects and particles, which are uniformly bright in a way that looks incorrect. And this is actually a big problem with HDR in general. I think a lot of the problem comes with the lack of standards on the display side and like confusion over adjustment, as well as the development side. So I already mentioned the development, but for a consumer, you're looking for a monitor, a TV. A lot of these things boast that they support HDR, and it's true. They accept an HDR signal, but the end result is anything but. And I often see people say, oh, I turned on HDR and it just looked washed out, or it just looked wrong. And they're absolutely right, because monitors have been sold for a long time. They often call it the HDR 400 nit range, but it's usually LCDs that max out around 400 nits, which is not bright enough for HDR. LCDs that have like a uniform backlight or edge lighting. They can't do the more per pixel or zone-based sort of dimming that is necessary to pull it off. Like if you have like a nice micro LED or mini LED. Both are things, but like an array of individual lights that you can toggle, or individual per pixels, like on an OLED screen. And you can support high brightness. You can get great results, but it's these lower end so-called HDR compatible displays, they just don't fit the bill and they don't look good. And I think it negatively colors people's perception of HDR, which then reinforces to developers that we don't need to bother with this, or it's not worth tweaking that much. And it's made worse the fact that Nintendo shipped the Switch 2 with a supposed HDR screen that falls exactly into this trap, and it looks like garbage. So people see that and they think, oh, this is what HDR is? Blah. Or like, this doesn't really do anything. And they're right, because it doesn't. On the Switch 2 screen, it's not good enough. It's exactly like these bad monitors. And that sucks, because all of these things coalesce together to create an atmosphere where it's really hard to get anything HDR out the door and show people what it should look like. But when you actually sit someone down in front of a proper HDR screen with a game that's well calibrated or a film, and you show them what it brings to the table, I think most people would agree it's actually game changing. Like it genuinely like transforms the atmosphere and the image you get. The way I look at it, especially, is a game with a sky, a movie with a sky. When you step outside and you look at the sky, there's like a certain level of brightness your eyes expect that monitors traditionally couldn't produce. HDR allows it to get closer to that. And your brain just automatically perceives this as like a more realistic thing, a more appealing thing, more natural to the eyes. Same with like highlights from bright light sources. All of this stuff, it just works. Your brain sees it and it's like, wow, this looks good. This feels good. This feels natural. And it's extremely awesome. And so as a result, I'm thrilled that Filippo is out here. He's working at Remedy. You know, he's evangelizing HDR. He's releasing mods. He's showing basically the world how it's done and targeting some big games while doing so, which I think is also really important, right? Because, you know, you get something like Starfield, for instance, right, Hollow Knight, Silksong, things like this that either didn't have HDR or had bad HDR. It's very nice to immediately grapple and be like, hey, I got a solution for you guys. And then when everybody's jumping in to play the game, there's going to be a subset with the right monitors that see it and they're like, oh, wow, this is awesome.
So he's also recently founded Gamma Studios, a company that's basically offering consulting services to the industry to, quote, improve their post-processing pipelines, implement HDR output, and do modern color grading. He's not talking about specific projects, except to say that he's helping Nvidia to integrate HDR into RTX Remix, which, that's awesome, right? I mean, Remix, as things stand, is pretty awesome, but this is pretty great as well. He's talking about some of the stuff that's just where things have gone wrong. As you say, half the monitors with fake HDR panels looking worse than SDR. Windows showing SDR content in an HDR container in a broken way. Windows upgrading SDR content to auto HDR using an improper formula. 2 major game engines not doing HDR properly out of the box. YouTube, right. We know this one, John. YouTube taking a week to publish a video that was uploaded in HDR.
Gosh,
it's not so bad
annoying
these days, but it's still extremely slow. And the fact that we need mods like Reno DX or Luma to fix the HDR in most games. He also says that movies aren't much better either.
Also, Rich, there's I had to use I'm using a monitor, the 45-inch 5K 2K OLED, right? And apparently with the way Windows works, it was not able to properly allow you to take full advantage of the highest brightness. So somebody actually found a way to, and I did this a while ago, but using the custom resolution utility CRU, you actually have to edit some metadata to increase it up to the correct amount of nits that it supports. If you don't do this, you end up actually losing highlight detail. You buy an expensive monitor that's capable of good HDR, and then you have to go through these extra steps because Windows has an issue. Mm-hmm. I mean, that sucks. That is a bad consumer experience, and HDR is so full of this.
Yeah. There's also a point Filippo makes where, there's been a lot of focus from developers on ray tracing, which is fair enough, except to say that there hasn't been a similar focus on HDR, which could arguably be more impactful for more users, certainly in the console space. Yep. Oliver, what do you think about all of this?
I have kind of complex feelings about HDR and the format overall. But I think this article makes a couple mistakes right off the bat. Not Filippo, but the article author. First,
Right.
he says that he complains about some games not having HDR support recently, and he says that's a slap in the face because HDR panels can do over 2K nits while SDR panels can only do 100 nits, and that's just not correct, right? High brightness displays can display HDR and SDR signals. SDR is a relative brightness standard. It can work well at low luminance and high luminance. It's not necessarily stuck to 100 nits or whatever.
Yeah.
And then there's also this comment about Rec 709, or really technically BT 1886, being inferior to Rec 2020, which is capable of displaying a much wider gamut. But in practice, when you're combining RGB, there are only so many colors you can make. And indeed, in content that is actually displayed using Rec 2020, oftentimes there's not a huge difference in colors. Games can do a little bit more with that than films, because films are limited by the properties of natural light, which doesn't really display those colors too well. But anyways, those are just a couple of minor critiques with the article framing itself, not with what Filippo's saying. But I think the interview, is interesting because he's getting at some fundamental tensions. One tension is, do you grade an SDR first or HDR first? And to what extent should those grades differ in terms of final output on display? So should you create a really punchy HDR image or a more subdued one that comes closer to the SDR presentation? And a lot of colorists and artists would say, I want those grades to match, but modern display tech kind of pushes you in the former direction. And indeed, the former look is very appealing. So what do? I don't think that question is settled, even within major game studios that are shipping HDR titles, right? That's a key question. And the other question is, who are you creating this HDR picture for? Someone with a really high-end configuration that's perfectly calibrated, or someone with a lower-end configuration that's maybe more typical, or potentially in a situation where the things might be miscalibrated. Filippo touches on some issues potentially here with the hardware formats that you might see a game on, indeed that you might see a game displayed in a panel that's not really capable of HDR, but is marketed towards being capable of HDR, and these kinds of issues, right? Even this article, I noted, is formatted in SDR, right? The article itself, the imagery in the article, they could have formatted that using HDR metadata. They could have captured it in HDR. They did not, probably because only devices, seemingly Apple devices, are like the only devices on this planet that can display HDR and SDR content side by side in a correct way with the correct colors and the correct luminance values. That is like really unusual here. So yeah, they've displayed this entire thing.
Whoa. Are you asking Microsoft to get Windows 11 to do that?
Well, it's just ridiculous because like macOS handles this perfectly. Windows is like atrocious with this. It's just completely broken. You always have to switch between HDR and SDR to get proper looking imagery in your display.
Do.
Yeah, so that's a bit of a shame. But also with Filippo says, I think there are a couple of points I wanted to make here. He basically says the fact is that SDR has never been standardized around display brightness. And that's true, but also the human visual system is a relative visual system. Like when I'm looking at a phone in a dark room versus outside in the sun, I'm getting a very different experience in those phones because my eyes are adapting to light, right? The pupil opens. With HDR, oftentimes it is an absolute brightness standard, as Filippo says, but it's also a relative brightness standard because we end up saying, okay, here's 1,000 nits on your display. But then you end up saying, okay, well, here's HGIG, here's dynamic tone mapping, here's all these technologies, because I don't actually want 1,000 nits on my 2,000 nit display. I want 2,000 nits on my 2,000 nit display. So we almost always end up back at relative brightness from absolute brightness. That's a common misconception here. Ultimately, like I do think that there's also just an element to this where you end up with this SDR versus HDR grading issue that doesn't always favor HDR, in the sense that SDR is the default. It looks good in a broader range of circumstances. It's less sensitive to calibration errors, it encodes and transfers better to different recorded mediums, which we certainly know, and it avoids poor transfers from absolute brightness to relative brightness because we almost always end up back up at relative brightness, even though it's an absolute brightness standard. So I think ultimately, like, there are so many issues, and if I'm a game developer and I'm looking at this situation, especially if I've worked in SDR for my entire professional life, and I'm looking at a format I'm primarily delivering to SDR formats for the gamers who are playing these games, and I'm looking at HDR, and I know I'm going to do a bad job with HDR because Unreal doesn't even support half the things I need and all these different aspects. Like, I'm really sympathetic to the position of the game developer in this situation. And I'm probably a little bit colder on I need HDR for everything. Like, I think HDR is great for a lot of different things. I think it's great for high brightness displays. I think it's fantastic. But it's not a panacea in every situation. It's just basically a way of addressing super high brightness displays But it's not necessarily like this just ship HDR. And obviously there's so much complication here, right? And that's part of the problem I think Filippo is expressing, and also what Rich and John have expressed as well.
What is the max nits of your current main display in SDR, Oliver?
I have a 2000 nit roughly television, two 2000 nit televisions, and then one 1500 nit monitor, 1600 nit monitor. But my monitor is really nice because it not only does it do 1500 nits for really bright highlights, it does 1500 nits for the whole panel, which is just stunning. Okay. So it's like a flashbang basically with full white in that panel. So I actually have to turn down the brightness a little bit on that panel. And I've got to say, like when you're looking at a game in HDR, like Ghost of Yote or Fast Fusion or another game like that, or anything but Kirby Air Riders, basically not Kirby Air Riders, not a lot of those games like that, but it's like a really stunning experience. So I think that's like incredible looking often, and I really appreciate that. But also you have to recognize that like that, you know, that mini LED monitor that I have is like probably the best in the business for blinding people. And like there are a lot of panels that aren't like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could catch a suntan off it. You know,
it's very uncomfortable to look at if you
like your brightness. I know that.
Yeah, if you push it, but yeah.
Okay, well, man, that's going to be a deep topic that's going to continue, I'm sure. But with that, let's move on. Okay, so on the Digital Foundry Slack channel, we like to post things that we really like, share them with the rest of the team. And John, this week you posted TimeSplitters Rewind. I've taken a quick look. It is pretty special, isn't it? Tell us more.
A team has delivered essentially like I want to call it, it's almost like a remake of TimeSplitters 1 through 3.
Right.
And I guess it's still an early version. Not everything's there, but they say it's got 28 maps, 20 arcade game modes, a bunch of other stuff in there. It's got multiplayer and a single player. It essentially rebuilds TimeSplitters stuff with modern graphics. And it looks freaking awesome. Like they actually really redid everything here. Like it still keeps that sort of like cartoony look that you expect from TimeSplitters, but done anew, and it's free. So it's like one of the weird, like this is so large in terms of what it offers that this could honestly be a retail product. I feel at this point, like it's good enough where this should have been released. You know, finish up the early access version, iron out any remaining faults, you know, polish it up a little bit more, of course. But like what's here is good enough where I would happily pay and love to have this out there on multiple platforms.
Amazing. I mean, I'm just looking at the footage now that they've posted their early access trailer, and you're quite right. I mean, this looks like the real deal. I mean, I'm just wondering about the legalities of it. I guess it's a fan-made project, which you know typically gets looked upon favorably. But you're right. The quality of it's quite exceptional, and it comes in the wake, I think, of various attempts of to bring back TimeSplitters, kind of just not happening, which makes this all the more remarkable, I think. What do you think, Oliver?
Yeah, I think that's a complicated issue with the legal rights. That's really the aspect I'm interested in. Perhaps I'm less interested in TimeSplitters and more interested in the legalities of things a little bit. But it seems like Crytek gave them permission back in 2013, who were the rights holders of TimeSplitter at that time. But that was based off the idea that it would be a non-commercial fan project, right? They gave them at least some kind of assurance at that time. I don't know exactly what kind of agreement they had drafted up or how extensive that agreement would be. But since then, the TimeSplitters rights seem to have moved to THQ Nordic. So it's not totally clear to me what they would do in this situation. I guess the question to me is like, is the toleration of the project a choice, or would the agreement that they signed with Crytek still stipulate to future holders of the IP that they be held to this agreement, right? And exactly how exacting is that language? It is kind of slightly uneasy ground given the amount of effort that's been put into this effort over the course of over a decade, I think. The enormous amount of work they've put into it. I just hope they aren't on any kind of questionable ground here at all, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's been described as like the biggest fan-made content project ever. John, tell us more about this. I mean, how okay, so it's Unreal, right? Or is it not?
Yeah, I believe it's Unreal. The history of this is quite long, and it actually stems from this team in 2013 or something. they got blessing from Crytek when Crytek
Yeah.
still owned the IP to essentially develop a fan project for the TimeSplitters IP. And in doing so, Crytek provided all the original TimeSplitters assets to them. They didn't use them in the end. They rebuilt them all, but they basically had everything. But then it just seems like it went through a lot of difficulties, people coming and going, leaving the project, sometimes the project stopping completely, switching engines. It's like a very complicated story. You can actually see it on their website. They have a full timeline from 2007 up to 2025, so 18 years
wow,
to get to this point. But remember, it's a fan game, and it's done with the free time of hundreds of people, and obviously it's been through a lot of ups and downs. So I'm not surprised that it took a while to make. It reminds me conceptually, the only other thing comparable to this in terms of what they're trying to undertake would be the Half-Life 1 remake, Black Mesa or whatever it was called. That one, which remade all of Half-Life 1. And that's basically what they're trying to do here, but for 3 games. But of course, TimeSplitters itself, each of the 3 games is decidedly different from the last. TimeSplitters 1 being far more simplistic. And then by the end, you get to TimeSplitters 3, and it's trying to be more like TimeSplitters meets Halo. Right. The second one is my favorite. That's the one that most closely resembles sort of like GoldenEye Perfect Dark model. It's really, really well done. And it was on original consoles, a beautiful 60 FPS game. Well, the whole series was 60 FPS, but it was excellent. Yeah. So I'm happy that they actually made it back here. And it seems like they were trying to coincide with the anniversary of PlayStation 2, which is when TimeSplitters 1 hit the market. So
yeah, I've just been working my way through the the convoluted timeline that's on the website here.
Right,
it is nuts. Quite remarkable. They basically at one point had to shift development from Unreal to CryEngine. Then they shifted back to Unreal, the Unreal Engine 4. It does look as though in 2018 things were sorted out with THQ Nordic. There were discussions with THQ Nordic to honor the agreement with Crytek. And they didn't have any specific need to limit them to CryEngine. So again, Projekt restarted on Unreal Engine 4. Man, this is like quite the journey here, to use the J word. Quite remarkable. But they've done an amazing job, and it is free to download. Easy to download as well, despite being, I think, 13 gigs or something like that.
Yeah.
And is there multiplayer, John, or is it just single player?
Yeah, there's multiplayer. Haven't tested it, but it's there.
Wow, amazing stuff. So I guess do check that out. Any final thoughts from either of you, John?
You do. They actually, for the single player stuff, you kind of got to work your way through the games sequentially, right? So it starts with TimeSplitters 1 based missions first. Which are, I would say, less interesting than anything that comes later. So you do have to slog a little bit through that stuff. But it's worth it. It's good. It's still, and it's fun to revisit TimeSplitters 1 stuff with this new coat of paint. That first level makes a strong impression with the baked GI that they have going on in the desert. It's beautiful.
Also, I was just taking a look at the final entry on the timeline there, where basically the game is moved to Steam Deck with Proton, and which is marked as the minimum spec requirements for the game, which is great as well. Pretty impressive stuff. Well, let's move on. It's now time for a supporter Q&A, which is a part of the show where every week we ask our supporters to comment on our topics that we're going to be discussing, suggest topics for inclusion, but crucially to supply us with questions for the Q&A section. We're going to kick off with 2 questions, which I've kind of lumped together, and it kind of follows on from a discussion we had earlier. So, Sam E. Corners. Dearest Foundryman, the times they are changing. Nvidia is not interested in PC gaming anymore. It's quite a statement. Crucial is shutting down. Apple RAM prices are now affordable. Is this the end? Are the dark ages of video gaming upon us? Do you see a light at the end of this scary tunnel? And can you share the good word with us, your flock, so that our hearts and minds may be at peace? Some guy person asks, AMD isn't coming out with anything to supplant the 9800X3D in 2026. There's going to be, I think there's rumors of a 9850 X3D, but it's just a clock speed bump. Anyway, Nvidia is at most releasing GPU refreshes with more RAM at a much higher price in 2026. We don't know the prices yet, by the way. If you want a gaming PC, is now the best time to buy with price hikes on the horizon. The rumor is that 16 gigs will cost $40 more. So if prices do go up, it doesn't seem that bad. Oliver, there's a couple of things I want to sort of go through here. I think there is very definitely a danger, perhaps, that for a couple of years at least, gaming might be sort of thrust into a sort of dark ages of sorts. Maybe not sort of a regression, although the RAM shortages are definitely concerning, but more to the fact that for various reasons, including like, the expense of new process nodes, we're probably not going to be seeing much advancement in the way of silicon. Maybe we'll see something happening nicely with CPUs in 2026, but I'm not expecting much from graphics. Obviously, memory constraints are concerning. Where do you see this going? I mean, do you think it is going to be the case that we're kind of going to be stuck where we are for a couple of years? And what about the concept of the price increases that are being talked about? Some guy person says here the rumor is that 16 gigs will cost $40 more. So if prices do go up, that doesn't seem so bad. I mean, I guess that kind of makes sense for the here and now, but what about the future? I also think it's worth pointing out that the extreme price hikes that we've kind of seen for memory are kind of like the retail market and not the sort of commodity prices that are negotiated. But even so, the direction of travel is only in one direction, and that's up, right?
Yeah, I would say also that $40, that's a bill of material increase. So you don't know exactly, if people are trying to preserve their relative margins, that could mean a $60 increase or a $80 increase. Who knows exactly what it would look like in the final product. You're not paying for the bill of materials, you're paying the retail price. That could be a considerably different proposition. But I think in general, there's definitely a lot of stasis with architectures. There's a lot of stasis in GPUs. I think we're expecting next generation GPU architectures, probably not for a couple of years, probably not until 2027 at the current rate. We're probably not looking at gigantic advances in CPUs either. I mean, the 9850 X3D is rumored and the 9950 X3D 2, bit of a mouthful. Yes. I think that's also rumored with the dual 3D cache. I don't know that there's quite as good sourcing on that one as there is for the 9850 X3D, because I think the 9850 X3D just leaked from AMD's website, right? So
yes,
it
did.
Basically a done deal there. But I think if you have a need, definitely buy now, or even if you're thinking about 2026, buying in 2026, I think you should buy now, because I can't predict the future, but I can predict that prices are not going to be lower in 6 months than they are now. So if you intend to buy, might as well buy now. I think AMD, there's some rumors that AMD is telling their partners they might increase CPU trade costs as well, so there are some significant cost increases in other areas of the industry as well, potentially coming. If you have hardware that you like now, though, don't go out rushing to buy new stuff just because you're worried about price hikes. But if you have a genuine need for new hardware, I think now is a sensible time to buy, unless there's something on the horizon that you see coming that you really want. But at the moment, I'm not really seeing that product that would be super compelling and super price effective that you'd want to have in 2026 necessarily.
Yeah, interesting. So, John, we've actually got an extra question on this. I mean, a lot of the questions we had this week were about the whole memory and AI crunch that we're experiencing at the moment. Anna Ray asks, "Hiya, DF crew! ! Given the crazy stuff happening with RAM prices, how will PS6 and the next Xbox navigate this in the future? Will we see meager improvements to the amount of RAM next generation consoles get? And if so, how will this affect games made for the next generation, as well as PC hardware? And what amount of RAM is enough? Thanks for all the hard work. I'm loving this newfound independence that you have. The content really shines because of it. Thanks for that." Yeah, interesting stuff, John. I mean, next generation. Here's the thing, right? I mean, there's this sort of crunch. If there's a demand for product, right, then I'm assuming that there will be a response to that demand, which is to say, maybe they'll create new factories to make more RAM or whatever like that. So there is going to be a response to it. It's just going to take time for this to actually happen. And I guess, if there is going to be an issue with next generation consoles, they can always just delay them.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this before, but given the situation, they haven't actually announced anything, right? Like, there's no reason to
Yeah.
accelerate the timetables in the current conditions. And given what I talked about earlier about long development cycles, it feels like it would behoove them to just wait, just extend the generation out longer, do what they can selling the current machines, and I think that'll be adequate for now. Like I don't feel the need for a PlayStation 6 anytime soon. I think most would agree that PS5 itself still feels underutilized to a degree. The only one that's possibly in a situation where they might feel the need to push their plans at the original timings is Microsoft, maybe, given that they've essentially kind of given up on Xbox Series. Like, not completely, but, you know, that's clearly the old Xbox, where they have new plans going forward in terms of what they want Xbox to become, which means they need to work on this new strategy with this new type of hardware that's going to be hitting. But again, the price issues could really create a problem for them there, I feel.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. There were rumors, Oliver, of the Magnus chip for Xbox having like 48 gigabytes of RAM. It doesn't seem likely in the current climate, but do you think next generation actually needs a lot more RAM?
I do think they need a lot more RAM, especially if you're throwing in all kinds of machine learning AI models and things like this. Could potentially be a significant increase in the RAM budgets that are needed for next generation consoles. I also just think, like, if we do have a next generation set of consoles without a big increase in RAM, conversely, that makes it harder to sell a next generation of consoles, I feel, as a huge technological increase, right? If we're still basically dealing with last generation kind of capacity constraints, that'd be a big problem. Now, I did the math on this, not that it's hard math, but I did the math on this briefly. I just looked at like what potential there could be in terms of capacities for PS6 for a Magnus chip. Like you said, Magnus, we think it's a 192-bit bus. So there you could conceivably have like 18 gigabytes or 24 gigabytes or 36 gigabytes. 36 gigabytes is what was rumored by Kepler L2, I believe. But 48 gigabytes would also be a possibility. On the PlayStation side, with a 160-bit bus, they could do 15 gigabytes, 20 gigabytes, or 30 gigabytes, with 30 gigabytes being rumored. So I think like on the PS6, if they were to go from 30 gigs, which is rumored, to 20 gigs, I think that would really suck. I wish they would just bite the bullet and give us a more expansive next generation division at the expense of cost. But I could totally see it just not being viable if indeed we're looking at the bill of materials in a year and a half or so, and RAM is like twice or three times as expensive as it is currently. If that's the situation, that's not a viable console, really, is it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly a lot of uncertainty going forward. And the fact that the platform holders, Microsoft, Sony, are to a certain extent, presumably kind of powerless to do too much about it. Now, I'm going to assume that there are going to be certain projects where they would have already secured the inventory that they need at certain prices that they need
Hopefully,
it to be. But obviously, console generations are just getting longer and longer, and these machines need to persist for longer and longer. So it's really important to get the obviously to get those contracts sorted out for as long as possible, but also to make the machine as long, to have as much longevity as possible as well. It's going to be super, super tricky, and maybe the solution there is simply to wait. I kind of do feel as though the current generation consoles have got the fundamentals right. I mean, a lot of the issues that we had with the prior generation have been completely I won't say completely solved, but certainly mitigated. I mean, we've got a decent enough CPU this time around. Is showing its age a bit, that's for sure. The big thing, though, was obviously the mechanical hard drive, which has been solved with the SSD. And I still think that in terms of use of the current generation, it's probably storage that is an area that still remains kind of underutilized to its fullest potential. And GPUs scale. That's the good thing about them. They are inherently scalable. So that side of things is okay. I think regardless, we are going to be seeing a big cross generation situation going forward when the new consoles do arrive, which is going to make things even trickier still in terms of like quote unquote holding back gaming from everything it can be. Just have to wait and see, right? Let's move on. Question here from Anxiously Chronoed Figured. Hello, digitally independent edge runners. Exclamation point. 10th of December marks the 5th anniversary of Cyberpunk 2077, and arguably it's still one of the best looking video games in history. Also one that keeps on improving. If you were to change one thing graphics wise in the game today, what would it be? Cheers! Exclamation point. I think, John, from my perspective, the only thing that kind of bothers me about Cyberpunk is the LOD popping in the city when you're in traversal. Otherwise, I don't really have too many critiques with it, especially with like RT Overdrive and everything that brings to the table. What would you like to see improved?
Yeah, that is a tricky one, isn't it? Maybe the LOD stuff. I mean, I guess character models are good enough for what they are, but maybe they could be slightly improved. Like it's hard to critique that aspect of it because that's really what it does so darn well. The visual quality is obscenely high throughout. Yeah, I don't really have anything else I feel like I need to see in that specific vision of what that game is.
They've pushed so hard, haven't they? I mean, doing the first AAA game that effectively did past-face lighting is like quite remarkable. I mean,
it really is.
Where do you go from there? And of course, they've improved it still further since then with stuff like ray reconstruction, which solved a lot of the issues that we brought up earlier on, or at least mitigated them. Oliver, tricky question, right?
Yeah, I think there is a pretty obvious answer, though, and it's exactly what you suggested, Rich, which is the pop-in issues, because the game, even on max settings at the moment, even with RT Overdrive, everything pumped up to the maximum, there's still a lot of pop-in when you're traversing through that city, when you're driving through that city. Also, just in general, like, assets are good-looking, right, but not up to the same level as, like, a high-end UE5 game necessarily in all areas. But that's, of course, understandable because it is fundamentally like a cross-generation game at its core. And then, of course, like you can look around and like, are the pedestrians like the highest fidelity relative to like GTA 6? I don't know, possibly not. But again, that's like you're stacking kind of unfair expectations on a game that is a 5-year-old game, right? Still one of the best looking games out on the market if you play it on high-end PC. So I do feel like those are perhaps unfair expectations. But there are some elements where you can see it showing its age a little bit, even though the lighting presentation is like absolutely phenomenal, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, in terms of stuff like NPC behaviors and stuff, there's always things that you can improve as such.
Oh, yeah.
Not necessarily graphics related.
But sure, the game, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, just the concept of being able to produce like genuinely convincing crowd simulations in a proper city like that, I think that's probably one area you could see some level of improvement. The question is, why would you do it at this point? Just save it for the Cyberpunk 2077 sequel if you're going to go down that route. But, even so, we've been treated to a deluge of improvements. I hope we see a PlayStation 5 Pro update at some point, though. That would be pretty cool. But with that, let's move on. A question here from Haran Butt. What games do you think are out/coming out that would be quote-unquote too big for Steam Machine? It's kind of like... riffs off your too big for Steam Deck videos that you do, Oliver. Here's the thing, right? I don't think there's really anything as such that's really going to cause problems. There are certain games that have come out where Alex has basically said on the PC versions that he can't produce optimized settings because the game just isn't optimal to begin with, and there's not really much to build on. I guess the most famous one in the past was Monster Hunter Wilds. There are going to be certain games that are demanding on what you might call reasonable settings, right? So the one that always springs to mind is going to be Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, which is a game that, on the PlayStation 5, it kind of scales back to DRS range to 720p at times with an FSR2 upscale to 1440p. Now, if the PlayStation 5 is doing that, it does look a bit murky, to be frank. Then I don't think the Steam Machine GPU is as powerful as PS5, so you're going to have to like lower resolution still further if you want the same quality settings. But the beauty of PC, of course, is that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and if you're okay with lower quality settings, then the game isn't really too big for Steam Machine. I think the issue is, Oliver, when you're talking about your Steam Deck too big for Steam Deck videos, rather. There's nothing you can do with some games. It's just you strip it back and it still doesn't run particularly well.
Yeah, I do think in this case, you have a baseline level of compute and bandwidth capability, CPU clock, all these different things that I think you should be able to get a pretty good experience, generally speaking, relative to that too big for Steam Deck issue. Indeed, with the too big for Steam Deck findings, I never really found that like an 8 gigabyte VRAM allocation was a problem there, probably because I was operating at such low resolutions with such low settings anyways with those titles. But I think this is going to be an issue potentially at 1440p or 4K. But if you're willing to step down to 1080p, if you're willing to make certain settings compromises, like Alex noted, he was going down to like low hair quality and low textures in Indiana Jones to get a pretty stable experience on an 8 gigabyte card. Those aren't cuts that you'd want to make in any circumstance, really, but they are cuts you can make to get a more stable experience. So I'd suspect those would work here just fine. I wouldn't expect games to throw up major issues with 8 gigabyte GPUs in the sense that you can always probably get an experience that's okay, at least in the vast majority of titles. But getting to that level might require some big settings cuts and big resolution cuts and things like this that you might not want to make otherwise on a machine of this capability.
Yeah, I guess the other thing is that a lot of Alex's optimized settings are kind of targeting 1440p on a 4060, which is an 8 gigabyte card, and I expect that those would transfer over quite nicely to Steam Machine, which has a similar sort of GPU budget. The difference being that, man, you know, when you're looking at 1440p, you're leaning heavily on DLSS, and I still think that the fact that there isn't a kind of equivalent quality upscaler available yet for RDNA 3 cards is going to be slightly problematic there. But even so, I still think it'll be probably work out okay, at least, you know, for the short term. And most games should run fine. And certainly when you consider just the length and breadth of the Steam library, we are talking sort of exclusively about the sort of big AAA games here. But let's move on. Got this question here from Jose Liz. Do you think Nintendo would have been better served by having the Switch 2 cost another $50 to $100, but match Series S performance? Do you agree that would have been achievable with a slightly better Nvidia GPU? I don't know about you, John. I actually think, based on what we've seen so far, Nintendo actually made and indeed Nvidia made a pretty good call with what they've done with the Switch 2 SoC.
I would say so. But beyond the actual technical results, may I ask him to go check out the sales for the Nintendo Switch 2? It seems to be among the fastest selling console, if not the fastest selling consoles ever.
Yes.
So given those numbers, I'm going to go ahead and say that Nintendo probably made exactly the right choice, because anything more, like, I think the price was already slightly borderline for some.
Yep.
Being higher than Switch 1, but it's still selling like crazy. But if you go up to like $600 or more, I think that's too much. I think that actually would have genuinely hurt its success.
Yeah.
Like, it would have still found success, but I think it would absolutely have hurt its sales overall. So I think they managed to work something out that delivers what they need hardware wise, while also coming in at the price budget or at the price that they require. So
yeah, Switch 2 Pro though, it's the future.
Yeah.
Oliver, what do you make about this? I mean, here's the thing, right? I mean, the whole sort of run up to the Switch 2 release, we knew about the specs for years basically, and there was always a concern that it was a bit anemic, and there were concerns about the process node, which essentially came to nothing apart from a slightly reduced battery life compared to expectations. But even then, it's probably the most efficient modern handheld available.
It is.
I mean, they could have made a bigger GPU. I guess they would have had to have paired it with faster memory modules to actually get the most out of that extra compute. But, you know, what can I say? You know, I think when we did, you know, simulations of Switch 2 and when we talked about Switch 2 specs, literally at the end of every video, I said, look, you know, if you think this is looking a bit anemic, just remember that the Switch 1 actually was a properly anemic technical specification, but developers worked miracles with it. And we've already seen that kind of stuff happening with Switch 2, right?
Yeah, I would say there are a couple factors that make this a little bit more complicated. First of all, you're only dealing with a node shrink from like 8 nanometers / 10 nanometers, you know, a hybrid of those two nodes, to maybe 5 nanometers or 4 nanometers, which are the kind of most advanced extant nodes that a company like Nvidia might have access to at the moment. 3 nanometers would have been out of the question, is out of the question right now for a graphics product, and would have been out of the question at the time of the Switch 2's launch. That kind of shrink, I mean, it's not been the case with other graphics products that would lead to like a doubling of graphics performance, which is what we're talking about here. Also, the memory bandwidth situation, because I think the Switch 2 is 6,400 megatransfers per second memory, at least in docked mode, at on a 128-bit memory bus. Now, at the moment, if you wanted to do faster, I mean, I know there are mobile products with like 7,500 mega transfers per second memory, even PC handhelds with like 9,600 mega transfers per second memory, but we're not getting a corresponding increase in memory bandwidth unless you go with an even wider memory bus, which is not really feasible on a device of this size. So I think those are our key questions. Even at the moment, when we look at PC handhelds at 20 watts, those are generally, probably comparably efficient, if not substantially less efficient than Switch 2 at delivering high quality visuals, right? Even though those are using much more advanced process nodes. That's an AMD versus Nvidia thing, but again, kind of militates against the idea that this is necessarily going to be an easy win in terms of achieving Series S performance. Series S performance is a pretty high target for a machine like this. I don't think it's feasible. Now, if I could go back in time and tell Nintendo, hey, Switch 2, even though you're taping out a chip for it in 2021, we're not going to be shipping this thing until 2025. Maybe they make different decisions. Maybe they choose a newer process. Maybe they choose newer architecture. But I think given the constraints they're probably faced with, Switch 2 is doing a good job. And I'm not necessarily sure that they could have shipped a similarly large chip on 5 nanometers that would have been feasible at all. Certainly, and that chip would have had a performance uplift like this user is suggesting. I don't think that's necessarily the case at all.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on. Final question. This one comes from Mars Mage. Hello, gentle Foundryman! Exclamation point. This upcoming week marks the 21st anniversary of the PSP releasing in Japan. Now that it's legally allowed to, would you mind cracking open a beer with the PSP and share a campfire story about handheld gaming that was memorable to you? Did any games of yesteryear amaze you as you first seen them on the small screen? Keep on independing. Cheers! Exclamation point. So, John, I think we might have talked about this in the past, probably have, but man, the PSP, what a launch.
Oh,
incredible.
goodness.
And Ridge Racers, the game that came with it, I mean, certainly crack open a beer to that experience. It was incredible.
Without a doubt, yeah. For my money, this has to have gone down as one of the most impressive launch periods that I can recall, just because in 2004, the idea of a portable game looking and running the way Ridge Racers did, it was basically non-existent. There had never been anything even close to that in the handheld space before, right? So this was, we already had feature phones starting to have games. Nintendo had just introduced the DS at the same time. There's the GBA before that. At best, in the mobile space, we're used to Game Boy Advance level visuals, which is kind of analogous to Super NES. So then the PSP comes along, and we're basically it's not exactly, but we're basically looking at PS2 class visuals, with some things being a little bit less so and other things being even more so. But it's that generation. It was the same generation of visuals. And the fact that you could see a game like Ridge Racers running at 60 FPS with all those, just the quality of the visuals and display, it was unreal. And it went on to amass an absolutely amazing library of games. And there were plenty that impressed. I remember I was weirdly impressed by the remake of Mega Man X back in the day.
Right.
I thought that was awesome. Irregular Hunter X, I think it was called. That was great to see. Killzone Liberation springs to mind as this really insane looking isometric take on Killzone that just looked as probably one of the better actual Killzone games from a gameplay standpoint as well. We had Luminous, which just got Luminous Arise this year, but the original Luminous was this magical puzzle game that combined music and matching shapes in a way that it was super addictive, and really it was the first of its kind, really, where this was from Mizuguchi-san and crew post Rez, and I was already a big fan of Rez, bought that on day one, and this was combining Rez and Tetris conceptually, and it was so well done, and the whole machine just felt futuristic, I would say. We got a new Wipeout, new Twisted Metal at launch. We got Metal Gear Acid, which people were initially disappointed about, but like it was an awesome card-based, turn-based Metal Gear game that was quite cool. And then over the years, we continue to see a lot of great titles, and I think the system sold 80 plus million units when all was said and done.
Yeah.
Got a lot of years of fun out of that thing, both single and, multiplayer, like the local, not hotspot, but whatever they called it, the local wireless multiplayer feature.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. But yeah, of course, like just the screen, he said on that small screen, but for 2004, a portable device with that sort of screen, it was a big screen. And it was high resolution, like a widescreen system like that. And nothing really matched what the PSP was doing in that portable space for many, many years. Like when the iPhone first released in 2007, 3 years later or so. And then once they added the App Store in 2008, and we actually started seeing more games in there, like it took years before like iPhone and eventually Android games could actually match what was being done on the PSP back in 2004.
Yeah, I mean, the library is pretty immense. The God of War games and Ready at Dawn, those were awesome as well. Wipeout Pure, another great game. The locked at 20 frames per second Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker kind of worked, right?
Actually, yeah, it did.
Yeah, lots going on there. Tekken 5. There's just Siphon Filter. I mean, it just goes on. Fantastic library. And also from that kind of golden period where Sony was very experimental with the kind of games it would put out. You'd get the AAA bangers, but also smaller games that were just really, really cool as well. I remember that period fondly. Another sort of campfire story I remember at launch was certainly amongst the journalism circles, there was the sort of comparison with the DS, and everybody thought Nintendo were going to get wiped out by the PSP. Didn't happen. The opposite happened, but the PSP was still really, really cool. And did really, really well, I think, for Sony. Oliver, were you in that period? Were you available for PSP gaming at that point?
I was just about barely, but I got a PSP in 2005, in the holidays of 2005.
Oh, cool.
So
nice.
I was there pretty early, not there on launch day, certainly, even in NA, right, which I think was March, but I did have it pretty early. My early thoughts of the PSP, though, are a little bit conflicted because I was really impressed by Wipeout on the PSP when I played it, but I was also struck by the fact that the visuals seemed jaggy to me at the time, especially relative to my DS.
I mean,
but
yeah.
They were, I would say, especially in that larger format panel, and with not crazy pixel density. But I also didn't really have the technical expertise to evaluate what the visual difference was between the PSP and DS at that time, and indeed if that was a generational difference. Of course, in time, I began to see that it was with games like Daxter was a game that really blew me away. I don't think that's been mentioned so far, but that was just like this great 3D platformer with wild particle effects, big stage sizes, detailed enemies, an open world hub, all these elements that really made that game super impressive visually. I just remember being astounded by that game. Obviously, later in the generation, you had the God of War titles, which really impressed me as well. But probably before,
7, right? Crisis Core.
Crisis Core was great as well. But even before those titles, probably what impressed me, maybe more than those titles, but not visually necessarily, was GTA Liberty City Stories, because that proved that you could have a GTA game on the system, that it could run this big, expansive open world like a console game, like nothing you'd ever seen before in a portable system. It couldn't run it very well. is the caveat. Those games ran very poorly. But yeah, just good memories with the PSP. I really like the PSP, really like the PS Vita, and hopefully Sony's next foray into portable consoles, quasi-portable consoles, will go equally well as the PSP, let's say.
Yeah, I enjoyed Outland 2006 as well. That's well worth bearing in mind. Burnout Legends I enjoyed as well, though obviously it's, there were some frame rate problems with it. But I do remember, of course, once the PSP was hacked, overclocking became a thing. I think you could.
That kind of solved most things on games, I would say.
But it did cause a gigantic piracy problem, unfortunately, for the system.
Oh, I know, that was unfortunate.
Yeah. Anyway, happy days with the PSP. Certainly a fantastic system. And if there is going to be a new Sony handheld, well, bring it on.
Dude, another thing, one more is just looking at my list here. they ported Test Drive Unlimited to the PSP.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
The 360 open world game. And it runs on a freaking UMD system. Like, that's just, to me, it's madness. The whole island, giant, it's basically like a Forza Horizon prototype, and it works on the PSP. It's just
amazing. Anyway, that was the final question there for the end of the show. Thanks for bearing with me, because I'm not feeling particularly well. I've got a bit of a chest infection. Anyway, we are here. We've done it. We've completed the show. Please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed it. Ring bells for notifications for you, potential algorithmic boosts for us. But really, it is all about the DF supporter program. Patreon.com/Digital Foundry. If you like what we do, if you want to support the team, basically our entire financial model is based on support and diversification of revenue. YouTube, not great. Anyway, please do consider that. Store.digitalfoundry.net if you'd like to wear clothes with our logos on it and cups and stuff. But that's all from us for this week. Inevitably, we shall see you again soon, quite possibly next week. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.